Okay, so it'd be good to start with understand a little bit your journey to getting to work in IT. Some people I've spoken to was the last thing on their mind, and they sort of ended up there by accident. And other people, I think one had been given a computer when they were 4 years old, and they were kind of, from that point onwards, that was where they were headed. But so it'd be good to understand your journey.
Yeah, it was also a complete accident for me. I mean, I'm a millennial, so I'm a digital native. I've always used computers, but I studied philosophy, politics, and economics at university. Went to work in charities, in campaigns for the first bit of my career, and actually, I ended up working in IT because I trained as an accountant. I trained at the UK's National Audit Office, which is the audit organisation that checks the finances of UK government bodies. And in my first year of my accountancy training contract, I was approached by the woman who was running the brand new data analytics team within the organisation, who I'd done a presentation, and she liked what she'd seen. So she asked me if I wanted to join them and be the very first data analytics accounting trainee at the organisation, and I jumped at the chance to do that. That sounded really exciting, and it goes from there, really. They trained me as a data scientist. I ended up running that team, implementing our cloud data ingestion platform, and when I left there, I've come to join a startup, which is an AI-driven data ingestion and analytics startup called Engine B, where I get to wear both of my hats, both as an accountant and as a techie, someone who understands data and analytics and that kind of thing. So total chance, really. But I've always been the kind of person who, if an opportunity was there in front of me, I've struggled to resist it a little bit. And it's meant I've had quite an interesting career so far in technology.
Yeah, and in terms of the journey to date, I presume there've been one or two sort of challenges along the way, and bear in mind the sort of focus of the conversations I'm having. Do you think any of them were to do with the fact that you were a female, or was it just general challenges that anyone might bump into as they're pursuing a career?
I think there have been challenges, some of them internal as well as external. I am very frequently, even today, the only person in the room who's not a guy. That's really, really common. I ran a team at the National Audit Office, which was 20 people strong, and quite often there were no other women in the team. That can be quite lonely. It can mean a bit more of a focus on how you're coming across. I find in some ways it's a blessing. I look younger than I actually am. People are surprised to see me sometimes in a position of authority, and that can be a disadvantage because people underestimate me. I can find people not quite convinced that I have the authority that I'm standing in for. I don't know, of course, if that's meant that I haven't got jobs that I've gone for. That's the sort of thing you can't know. But I do know that sometimes I have to do extra work to get taken seriously. People will address questions to my male colleagues instead of to me. People will expect them to have answers when I'm the expert. And I would say that's been as much a problem in accounting spaces as it has been in tech spaces, and I sit between the two. So that can be a challenge, other people's expectations, and then sometimes it is a bit lonely when you're working with a team of people, all of whom have very similar experiences, and you don't. Sometimes they can forget that there's someone in the room who's not a guy, and I have to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be making jokes like that. Maybe we shouldn't, And if you're the only person calling that out, that it can get a bit tiring.
Okay, and in terms of the what you've seen during your career to date, do you think things have moved at all, changed at all, and hopefully in a positive direction, or do you see it much the same as when you started out, or I say, have things got a little bit better at least?
I would say I haven't been working in IT and tech all that long, probably 6 years now. And I think change happens slowly. I've had the benefit of working in organizations that are reasonably enlightened, I think it's fair to say. So I have been insulated against some of the things that I know friends and colleagues have experienced elsewhere. So I wouldn't say I've seen much positive change, but when I compare it to experiences that colleagues or friends talk about from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, things are much better, and there are also a lot of resources. So, there's forums like Our Ladies or Women in Tech, Women in Data, that kind of thing. Those help it feel a little bit less isolating if you are the only woman in the room. And I've also seen more organisations saying things about diversity, trying to improve the level of female representation, more places promoting women to higher levels. So I think it seems like it's going in the right direction. It doesn't seem like it's stalled, but changes slightly.
Yeah, and so I'm also just interested. You say you joined Engine B, it's a startup. So would that have a slightly just naturally a more enlightened, just because of the fact that it's it's not a traditional 50-year-old company. It's very young, agile, and therefore it has a shall we say a more enlightened attitude to diversity and just general workplace behaviour.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think those things are true of Engine B, and I think actually that's a reflection of our founder culture. So we've got two founders, one of whom is female, so it's 50-50 owner-founder representation there. They are both very committed to gender equality. I was an early hire. I think I was the 8th or 9th member of staff, and I'm one of only two who've been around for that long now, apart from the founders. And I was hired into a senior leadership position, and we have therefore had a commitment to gender equality from early on. Now, I'm not going to say we're perfect, because no organisation is. We exist in a culture that's not perfect on a number of fronts, but culture comes from the top, and we have a culture and a leadership that is committed to equality and diversity. I've got colleagues who work with other startups where there's much more of a frat boy or a bro culture, and because you don't have the restrictions in a startup, that can take it the other way. That can be the opposite of those 50-year-old organisations that are aware of their legal liabilities, for example. So I've been lucky, but also it's much easier to test the culture, I think, of a startup before you join, because you have to have those conversations with the senior people. You can test out what they think. And so I think it's perhaps in some ways more of a risk. There's no sort of formal internal HR. We've got outsourced HR, etc., which can have an impact, but also you get to see really what the people in leadership think, and they can have a much more direct effect on the day-to-day.
And in terms of the move you made into the sort of a world of IT, were you at all sort of nervous when you're doing it, whether not so much maybe the diversity, but just the reputation, if you like, IT has for being a bit sort of old-fashioned, male, pale, stale, I think is the cliche. Did you have some reservations, and perhaps also to folks that might be in a similar position that you were looking at it, would you warn them of that, or just say no, go for it because it's things are changing? Just thoughts about that.
I think it's really interesting. When I moved into working with IT, I had just started an accounting training course. Now, accounting is pale, male and stale, right, in leadership. And that was true with the organisation I worked in, although they're doing their best to address it. And quite interestingly, it was a woman who was only a couple of years older than me, a queer woman like myself, approached me and said, would you like to work in this team? And so the leadership and the vision I was seeing was not pale, male and stale to move into IT. When I took it to my line manager and said, look, I've been approached, I've been offered this opportunity, should I take it? His response, and he was a middle-aged white guy who'd been doing audit in precisely the same way for years and years and years. He said, no, you can't do that. We're not going to allow you to do that. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that's a red rag to a bull. I said, what do you mean I can't? I was only considering this, and now I've decided it's what I want to do. So for me, and I think this is really important, I had a mentor that I could see myself in, who was saying to me, come into this new industry, come into this new way of doing things, there's space for you here. So it didn't feel like I was stepping into a pale, male, stale reality. It felt like I was stepping out of it. And I'm a trustee of a school, it's a girls' school. And one of the things I'm trying to say to the school and to the students that I have contact with in that space is, I know that the media portrayal of IT looks a very particular way and it doesn't look like you, but that's not the reality. And I have so many fantastic women who I know who work in technology, and I'm just trying to show them to people, really. And I think, interviews like this are a really good way of saying there is this perception and we do have a demographic problem, but it's also that's not the whole reality. There are enough of us here, we make up a large enough proportion. So that wasn't my view when I stepped into it. It was only later that I realised that actually I was stepping into this actually quite male-dominated space.
Okay, in terms of also sort of other things you think that could usefully be done to improve the situation, have you got any thoughts as to what those might be, or whether it's in the sort of education side, as I think you've alluded to, getting people early? And I mean, to me, the IT industry is so exciting at the moment because there's so many different things going on. Almost every business, if you look under the covers, there's some fairly important IT running it or helping to run it. So it should be easy to convince people what an exciting place to go, but for some reason there's a bit of a disjoint. So any thoughts as to how that can be addressed?
One thing I would say is that culture is really critically important, but so are policies and processes. IT feels to me like it's set up perfectly to support the kind of family-friendly and lifestyle-friendly policies that actually benefit everyone. They don't just benefit women, but we know that women drop out of the workforce or don't go for promotion because they are worried about their ability to have a family and balance it with a job. If you're working agile, the ability to have a person step out of the team for a bit and then step back in later and pick stuff up is ideal. There's much less disruption in an agile environment than there is in a waterfall environment. And yet, in my experience, technology teams, technology projects, often because they have been historically male-dominated, seem less willing to flex around people's needs, less willing to, startups don't tend to provide brilliant benefits in that space. NGB is a good example of they've absolutely tried their best to balance that better. But also the culture can be in a lot of tech teams and tech structures can be not necessarily terribly welcoming, and more could be done to keep the pipeline open and to encourage women in. And it's not just women, if tech teams culture is built around work hard, play hard, where play hard means you will go to the bar at the end of the night, there are religious communities that aren't going to be so into that. There are going to be, people with disabilities that aren't so into that. When we can work remotely, when we can have other kinds of fun, and when we can flex around people, that will provide dividends in all sorts of diversity, not just for women. And I'm some of it is just, it would be great to get women and girls feeling confident to just take the risk, get involved, develop the skills. But employers and teams have to meet people where they are, really.
To that extent, do you think the pandemic, I mean, clearly it was horrific in many ways, but one silver lining was the sort of hybrid work model was accelerated, or people got used to it. And then, trying not to be too political, but then the government told us all to go back to our offices and buy our lunchtime sandwiches so that the city economies didn't go belly up. But do you think there is a lasting change for the better, that many more companies are much more open to a flexible approach to work, which, as you say, benefits everyone, but particularly some of those groups you've alluded to?
Yeah, I would hope so. I certainly know more and more women who have worked in other spheres who are interested now in getting into, cloud computing or UX UI design or cybersecurity, etc., who feel that they can do that because rather than having to sit in a basement server room like you might have had to previously, you can now do a lot of that from home. And of course, the cloud computing revolution has helped with that too. There are things you could not do remotely before that you can do remotely now. And so I'm hopeful that we preserve those benefits. It does help a wide group of people. And I have seen, the COVID was awful for all sorts of people, but it did give us all the chance to think about our lives and what we want. And that has given a lot of women the option to say, I want a different kind of life, and IT is the way to achieve that. It's, I think, led to an upskilling in some groups who haven't previously been able to consider themselves in an IT career, but there's so much training available now, especially training targeted towards women, that career transition, that career change is a real option. So I'm hopeful. But again, it depends on how organisations are run. I think organisations that insist people come back in are going to see a brain drain. But if everybody insists people come back in, then there are going to be fewer options.
Okay, and maybe just in finishing, in terms of, you've already alluded to some things that can maybe improve the situation, but if you could change one or maybe two things in the IT industry for the better, or stop some practice or introduce something, what sort of things would you think would have a obvious immediate benefits?
That's a really interesting question. And some of this is about the economy as a whole, right? I would say policies that enable people to have a full life alongside work. So, as standard, full paid parental leave for 6 months for both genders, and possibly a use it or lose it for non-birthing parents, for fathers, would do a huge thing. Because actually, we're not going to have women engaging in the workplace and able to stay in the workplace and treated as equals in the workplace until the burden of parenting falls equally on men and women. And that affects, I don't have kids right now. I am aware that probably since I was in my mid-20s, it is something that people have considered when they've been thinking about hiring me. Some places maybe not so much, but other places have been fairly explicit about, how can you confirm to us that you're not going to go on maternity leave as soon as we hire you? That's an illegal question, but people ask it. Until the expectation is that everybody has a personal life and everybody has a family life, and that's a good thing, and we should support that through work, we're never going to get to a point where we've got equal levels of engagement and equal levels of support, and actually where it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman or non-binary or whatever, because you're here to work and you've got the skills, and that's what we want.
And maybe just finally, are you optimistic? I mean, I think everyone would agree progress is being made, and perhaps everyone might also agree that not as quickly as is desirable. Are you optimistic that we will sort of arrive at the final destination where, if you like, conversations like ours are no longer necessary because just it's automatically everyone is treated equal, and there's no sort of issues around diversity, etc. Or do you worry that unfortunately there will always be an element that is traditional in its thought and therefore resists this sort of what we hope will happen?
I would say that I think the tone and direction that we're going in generally is positive, but I think that that's because there are people who have been fighting unbelievably hard to make that true. I would say wherever there's progress, it's because people have fought for it. It's not a natural direction of travel for the world. I don't believe in this kind of inevitable progressive improvement as we all become somehow more civilized. I think that's because people fight. And there are a lot of people doing that fighting, and, more power to them. I hope that I can be contributing to that as well. But I think if we keep up the pressure, we'll get there.
Okay. It's been lovely to chat, and thanks for sharing some insights
nice
with
to
us.
meet you,
So, Franki, thank you. Thanks again.
Cheers. Nice to meet you.